What's up, Internet? You're tuning in to episode 139 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where a few best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined, as always, by my very good friends and co-hosts, Mr. Stephen Radford.
Hello, hello.
And Mr. Max Wright.
Good evening, boys.
I caught myself almost say Stephen Wright, and I gotta say,
not marry us off just yet.
Have you been cheating on me with another Steven?
I think that would be your amalgamation if you guys did the fusion dance from Dragon Ball Z. You know,
That's when we get married. It's fine.
Yeah, I don't want to excite Andy too much, but there might be some wedding bells in the future.
Some questions being popped in the near future.
Yeah. Ask it in Discord, so it's really special.
Yeah, you want the whole community to be a part of it, obviously. But we'll save that one for next week's show after the engagement happens, and we'll focus on the news for this week. And of course, the headline that just broke earlier today that's got us buzzing is that PlayStation has finally named who is going to be the new CEO of the company, and it turns out it's two people, both Herman Hulst and Hideaki Nishino is how I'm gonna guess that's said. Apologies if not, Hideki. Are going to be jointly succeeding Jim Ryan as the CEOs of Sony Interactive Entertainment. Herman Hulst is now going to be leading the newly minted Studio Business Group, very, very sexy name, which includes all of the first-party teams and then also extends to the external development of PlayStation IP. So that would mean Herman would be in charge of heading up projects like, the HBO Last of Us adaptation, the Twisted Metal show that we saw on Peacock, that sort of thing, right? Any non-game extensions of the IP like TV and film will also be under Herman's purview. And of course, Herman, most recently known as the head of PlayStation Studios, we know him as the co-founder of Guerrilla Games, the team behind Horizon and Killzone. So he's been at Sony for a long time. He's somebody with game development background. Makes sense for him to be the one leading this team. And then if you're not familiar with Hideki's work, Hideaki Nishino is going to be leading the Platform Business Group, which includes console hardware, tech, accessories, So basically, Herman's heading up software, Hideki's heading up hardware. And Hideaki was already the, it's SVP, I believe that's Senior Vice President of Platform Experiences. So he's another person who's kind of a longtime Sony employee following their kind of history of promoting from within, but having two leaders in this role is something that they've never done before. So, Steve, I want to get you off the bench. When you saw this, what was your initial reaction to the news?
My gut reaction was, I think every great company needs two people driving a company in completely opposite directions. What great companies do you know that don't have two leaders that are driving them all over the place? I mean, The only companies I can think of that I know had co-CEOs were BlackBerry, and we know how that went, and Netflix in the last year, which has not been going so great either. So, I mean, all the best, but it kind of feels a little bit strange to have two people doing what was traditionally one job and having like a cohesive leadership and a cohesive direction led by one single person. It feels like maybe this could become disjointed, but it's also potentially a sign of the direction that PlayStation's going, that potentially their future is not just hardware and it's not just selling boxes anymore, that maybe software is going to become a more important part of their business. And that's why they want someone leading that specifically, as well as having someone also leading the hardware side.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I've seen a lot of people kind of critiquing the what organization doesn't have two leaders, right? Like, of course, this is a proven strategy, right? But I don't think it's as goofy as it seems on its face, like when you think about it, because I think, to your point, Steve, it doesn't even have to just be software, though, right? Like, I mean, we saw what a massive success HBO's Last of Us adaptation was and how that directly influenced PlayStation's business, right? And then more recently, we have the Fallout example to point to, right? Where like the development of that show was, a big project for Bethesda. And not only was it something that was, commercially successful as a product on its own, right, for the company, it had a huge influence on the success of the Fallout IP, right? And all the games that already exist, right? We talked about it on the Steam Deck podcast just a couple weeks ago about how every modern Fallout game was in the top 10 most played games on Steam Deck by hours, right? And they were also topping the regular Steam charts, right? And hitting new records of concurrent players and stuff like that. So I have to imagine that every big, publisher that has a deep bench of IP is thinking about, okay, how do we get into Hollywood, right? Because video games seem to be the next, comic book movie.
Yeah, I don't understand that for Sony though. It really is like, how do we get into Hollywood? You own movie studios. Sony's in line to buy Paramount at the moment. It's like you already own Columbia. And you already have Sony Pictures. So, like, do you really need to get into Hollywood? Can you just give your IP to the other arm of your company and just be like, go make something?
I don't think it's that simple if you want to really have something that's successful, though, right? Like, I think the pairing of, HBO and The Last of Us was one that was a fruitful partnership for everybody involved, right? And I imagine that, given the fact that it takes a lot of resources and a lot of like effort to, get projects like that off the ground, that partnering with other, creatives and studios and production companies and stuff like that already have, kind of inroads is probably a better move than tying the success of these other parts of your business to PlayStation inherently, right? Whereas like, there's less risk involved if you partner with some other entity that needs content and has a desire to produce something like Twisted Metal. And if it does well, great, then it's a boon. And if not, then you didn't take all the risk associated, right? Because Paramount or Peacock or whomever it was that produced that show, right? They needed original content. They wanted something that had movie star Anthony Mackie and Stephanie Beatrice from Brooklyn Nine, right? They wanted that on their platform. So they probably put up a lot of the money for production and marketing, right? In the same way that we saw HBO do that, where The Last of Us just being on HBO was a huge reason that it was successful because people watch HBO and it being an HBO show lends a certain amount of legitimacy to it in a way that the Twisted Metal show on Peacock or the Halo show on Paramount, Plus, like they don't have that same level of cultural cachet. And you could argue that it's because the quality isn't as good, and that's probably a part of it. But if
I think it is because like you've seen Fallout succeed on Amazon Prime, but maybe that's just because it was there and everyone.
And again, Amazon Prime is a service that people use because a lot of people have an Amazon Prime subscription. So even if you're not actively watching stuff on Prime all the time, you probably are trained to go look for movies there or whatever. And if
I'm doing my Amazon shopping, it was on the homepage, so it's like,
yeah,
it's like, oh, well,
and it's like I could download the app and watch that for free. I already pay for the damn thing. That's way different than expecting somebody to start paying for Paramount Plus so they can watch Halo, which is whatever.
Did that happen? Did people come out in droves to watch Halo? I've genuinely not heard anything about this show.
No, it was not particularly successful. The fact that you haven't heard anything about it, I think, speaks volumes of what an impact it made, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they also had a disastrous launch for Paramount Plus. In the UK, you couldn't watch Star Trek for like a month or 2 months because they decided to make it exclusive to Paramount Plus, but they hadn't launched it in the UK. So like they had to come up with some weird workaround. So because they're married to these obscure platforms, it's kind of strange. I think you're right. Everyone knows HBO, everyone knows Netflix, and that makes a lot of sense. But I don't know how much they see that as being driven from the CEO. And what I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Herman will be a driving force behind bringing more of their IP to other places. But I think. Yeah, he's a game developer front and center. He comes from Guerrilla. He obviously was running PlayStation Studios. He's now kind of the CEO of this new studio business group. So I think he's very much gaming focused. And
For
I
sure,
think it's nice. It's good to see that they've got someone from that background in that role. Because
Absolutely.
that was one of my main concerns with Jim Ryan, right? He's just a business guy. He's doing what's good for the business and what benefits the shareholders. And that's fine. You know, he brought a lot of money in for Sony and for PlayStation. But it wasn't necessary. He didn't necessarily understand gaming culture in a way that I think someone like Herman will.
I think he was successful at steering the ship once they had already become successful, right? That was a thing he was capable of doing. But now that the industry is changing and things are evolving, like, I do more have faith in someone like Herman that comes from the artistic side. Max, you've been trying to get off the bench here. Hit us with your thoughts.
I was going to say, Herman, I feel like when the conversation was, who's going to, or, Jim Ryan stepping down, I assumed Herman Hulst was the guy. We've seen him move up pretty quickly. So, I think we all probably became aware of him after Horizon came out and he was the head of that studio. He's really sort of gone strength to strength, and I think people were probably, I guess, but by when Jim Ryan announced his retirement, there was like, rejoice, he's gone, or people have maybe become a bit frustrated with his action or inaction or just everything sort of the last few years that he's been doing at PlayStation. I think Herman just makes the most sense for that role. What a crazy couple of years for that guy to go from just like, I'm the head of the studio to like, Christ, now I'm the head of the whole of PlayStation after.
Yeah. It's been a hell of an ascent.
Yeah.
And I guess to touch on something that Steve said, I think something that is interesting to me too is that a lot of the examples of successful adaptations of these IP have come when creative leadership from the game studios are directly involved in the development, right? Like, we saw Neil Druckmann be really involved in The Last of Us. We saw Todd Howard be really involved in Fallout. I don't think that there's a mistake that those ended up being standout successes. And I think the idea that you have Herman, who's this person who understands game development on a fundamental level because he's done it, right? And he has, I think an affection for, like Sony's IP and all that stuff, right? Because he comes from one of those studios. Like, I think him kind of being the person steering the ship of all of the kind of broader, like, creative ambitions, right, of like their intellectual property, is something that I think is good, because I think even though he's maybe not somebody that like has a Hollywood background or anything like that, I trust him to choose good partners, right, and help other studios within the camp kind of, hopefully see the same kind of success that Neil and Naughty Dog did with adapting their work, right, of finding a showrunner that was passionate about the story, right, and that understood it and wanted to have the team kind of be connected to it, right, so that it is something that feels authentic to the people that are already familiar with the IP, and inviting to the people that aren't, right, I think is something that they've got to want to replicate, right? Like
we've seen what Sony is capable or not capable of when it comes to their sort of comic IP. Like, without the involvement of Marvel Studios, all of the Sony, Morbius, Madam Web, all of these,
everything except for Spider-Verse, right? They've had their hands on.
have been dog shit, really, And I think I can see why they might be hesitant to just go, well, we already have the people in-house to make this stuff, when there's probably people who have more vision and are more capable of doing these things justice, or at least not, putting the money into it that they're going to lose, because they have to imagine they knew that they were going to make a loss with Madam Web, and having, like, they at this point, when making this decision, they don't want to replicate that.
So to take it back to the kind of like two leaders of it all, I think it is interesting to think about those businesses as being separate, right? Because like clearly they're not, but I do think that the idea that you maybe need two people kind of steering those different sides of the business in a more active way, rather than having that be all one person's responsibility, like, doesn't seem that crazy to me when you think about how much PlayStation Studios has grown in the last couple of years, right? Like, obviously, we saw the closure of a couple studios within the last 2 years, I guess, maybe even 18 months, right? With London and the Concrete Genie studio, whose name is escaping me right now. But yeah, I mean, obviously there was the acquisition of Bungie. There was kind of this eye towards, all this aggressive expansion in, these live service directions that are seemingly not happening anymore, right? And it's like the idea that like they need somebody to kind of grab the reins and, have full focus on managing all the studios that they currently have in their stable and making sure that they're healthy and that the projects that they're working on are moving along at the right pace as game development costs is getting higher and, more studios are seeming to be at risk, right, after a bad project. I don't know. I don't necessarily hate the idea of not having someone's attention split between, managing whatever the next PlayStation accessory launch is going to be versus making sure that their stable of studios are being properly managed and getting the resources that they need.
I wonder if they just couldn't find someone that wanted to do the job. Maybe they went to Herman and was like, look, do you want Jim's job? And he's like, I know nothing about the hardware side of the business. It's not really my remit, but I know about software. Like, could we get someone else who's got that experience, who has worked closely with the Sony Corporation and building these kind of consumer electronics? Or whether it's just because they felt like they wanted that. They wanted to have a little bit more hands-on CEOs this time around, because I feel like Jim maybe he had a vision, and his vision was like live service is the way to go, and this is what we're going to do. And he obviously handed off the hardware to Mark Cerny, who led the architecture of the PlayStation 5 and probably Sony Corporation pushed for a lot of the accessories, I would imagine. But I don't know that I don't know this is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think we will know until we find out what the vision
until
is.
The experiment
but I think
succeeds or fails.
Yeah, I think one thing for certain for me is that this is going to lead to more game cancellations, probably more layoffs, probably more studio closures as the new CEO and the new leadership teams come in and decide that they want to change the approach. They want to change the direction of the company, and they want to greenlight some projects and kind of bin off some other projects. Live service games are probably going away. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Bungie go up for sale, and they kind of try and claw back a little bit of that cash if live service isn't going to be their future anymore.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one to me. I hadn't really considered the idea of them selling Bungie off and trying to kind of refocus their efforts that way. I guess that's possible because, I don't know that acquisition ever made sense, right? And that it's clearly not necessarily borne fruit for either side so far. I don't know about more layoffs overall, like at the PlayStation Studios proper. Not to say that it's out of the realm of possibility, right? Like we've seen a lot of them lately, but PlayStation did just go through a big round of layoffs, and a lot of that was, I think, and you and I were speculating, but I think a lot of that was probably cleaning house on the folks that were there for those live service projects at Naughty Dog and Guerrilla and Insomniac, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, and the person who was in charge, Hiroki Totoki, is the CFO, so he's very finance focused. He was probably coming in and being like, where can I cut costs before we get someone in who's got a vision, and then they've got kind of an open checkbook to do what they need to do. That's
kind of my thinking there as well, is like that's kind of part of this as well, as both of the two of them are going to report to SIE's, Hiroki Totoki, who's the chairman, right? He's been the acting CEO since Jim Ryan stepped down. So for like the last 2 months or whatever. And that's when all this happened, right? So the idea that like, the kind of pivot that's happening right now that we're in the middle of seeing is something that Sony's leadership team, right? That includes all three of these guys that are now steering the ship, right? Had kind of come to this conclusion, and the last several months have been the starting of that happening, is kind of what I think is happening. Like I think the idea that there are a lot more layoffs to come doesn't, again, I think there's a very good chance that you're right, just based on what the last 18 months, 24 months have looked like. And I think given we just saw such a big cleaning of house, and I think kind of, tightening up, right, between closing down studios. Oh, Media Molecule, right, was another one. I think they trimmed a lot of that fat already from their perspective, and I think what's kind of left is what they look at as the core studios that have,
I think there's always room for more trimming, and I do think that anytime a leadership changes, they want to put their mark on things. They want to make sure.
But how different is this leadership, though? Right? Like it's like
that's true. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, Hideki is doing some work on the third party relation side of things and working with indie studios and other publishers. Does that include like the Arrowhead team, for example? Do they sever that relationship, or do they double down on that kind of thing? Like, do they focus in on 100% going first party instead of working and partnering with other studios? I think that's a question that we don't know either. I think one thing that's crazy for me is Hiroki Totoki's been doing 4 jobs for the last 4 months, but we need 2 co-CEOs to do 1 job. No, he's been the
CEO, COO, and CFO.
Yeah, and it's like, what?
Yeah,
he's like doing everything
at that point, right? He's just the chief officer.
He's just the chief. He's just the chief.
But genuinely, though, like I when you talk about that, right? Like to me, I don't know how much this actually represents a leadership change as much as like he's in charge, right? Like he's clearly the guy in charge. Like he's been having like all of these very key C-suite roles already, right? And then has been acting CEO for the last 2 months. We saw a bunch of layoffs. We've seen a bunch of efforts towards restructuring under his leadership. And now he's the one that these 2 guys that are, they're the CEOs, but they both report to him. So it's like, in what way is that actually a change in power structure? Because for the last few months, that's what's been, they already reported to the direct CEO, right? To me, it feels more like it's like, it speaks to the overall growth of PlayStation, right? And like how much they've grown from acquiring studios, from expanding the studios that they had to be all like have multiple teams and all these projects in development. They're expanding into, trying to expand their IP to, other mediums and all this. Like I think you see so much more happening there. Or like on the hardware side of things, right? Like talking about accessories and everything, and how we've had multiple conversations about, the way people perceive the PlayStation Portal as like this weird thing that wasn't for anybody, but like it's sold so exceptionally well that it's like it still sells out, right? So it's like, I don't know. It seems like they're doubling down on both sides of what they do, and maybe that's just kind of, we're seeing like the devaluing of the CEO position at Sony because Sony's becoming bigger, And I'm not saying that means that it's a good idea or it's going to work, but I guess I can see the thought process when like Hiroki Totoki's already been the guy steering the ship, right? Seemingly.
Every time you say Hiroki Totoki, I think knees bent armed straight, rah 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 or whatever.
Rah, rah. Do you know the Hokey Cokey, Pete? That's what that's a reference.
It's a great point.
No, I don't.
You don't have the Hokey Cokey over there.
No, I just let
every
these
time
British
I do it
blow
now,
by.
I'm gonna do sing the Hiroki Totoki and turn around. That's the new lyrics.
I'm sorry, Pete. I didn't realize you didn't know. I didn't mean to.
Well, we have Hokey Pokey, which it sounds like it's the same thing, I guess.
It's the same thing, yeah. It's the exact same thing.
Pokey? Nah.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. Okay. Fair enough. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things that we'll see whether or not it bears fruit in time. I think the one thing that I look at as wholly positive is that I like Herman Hulst, having that background. I was going to say having the background in game development. That's what I was going to say. Mm-hmm. Not that I don't know, like his time as head of SIE, I think has been, not super eventful, right? Like I like the games that have come out under his leadership. So I'm inclined to say, he's been doing a good job.
But he's also been there pushing out like Jim Ryan's live service games. That was
Right.
his thing, right? He was the one driving the studios to work on those. He's the one that's led the layoffs. Like, so he's
So it's like
he's not without fault.
No, and there's a reasonable question there of like how many of those decisions are at his feet versus like they were coming from the top down and you're executing on your boss's vision. And I don't say that to defend him or pass judgment on him. It's more like my perception of him as a leader is not super well defined. But the thing I do like is I prefer to see folks that have actually led a studio and know what it means to lay people off from a creative standpoint rather than a line item standpoint, because I think that is a thing you and I talk about all the time when it comes to these like kind of business guys with a business background, right, coming in and running a studio. Don't think about what it actually costs to lay off talent, right? Because yes, it's I understand that it's a business and you've got to studios need to be profitable and they need to think about the health of the entire arm of studios and family of studios and to them it's like, well, we're getting rid of a Media Molecule or a London or something like that to focus and protect the studios that make money and that's all well and good, but when you lay off talent at any of those kinds of core studios, right, that they're doubling down on, like there are studies that show how much it costs to hire new talent after you let go of senior talent or talent that's been there long enough to be in the rhythm, right, of how the studio operates. And those are things
if it's
that are
studios that are building games they don't want to make anymore,
right,
and they're people who are focused entirely on making live service games. And PlayStation's just like, well, we're not making those anymore.
Yeah, but I mean,
those
that's
are
the thing.
people that probably aren't going to be here.
We talked about that though. Like when those layoffs happen, like I don't mean to minimize the impact and the human cost of those layoffs, and they make sense. I think there's a big difference, and we talked about this with the Xbox stuff, right? There's a big difference between closing a studio that you no longer have need for, or that has never made money, or that has never turned out a significant hit, or something that was of artistic merit or whatever, right? Like those are all things that those losses are still sad because they affect human beings. And, I don't want anyone to lose their job. I always want there to be more places to work to make games. And that makes sense versus closing down a studio that has a team that is turning out award-winning games and is, actively adding to the kind of portfolio in a meaningful way, even if they don't make as much money as the bigger studios, right? And like, I think those are two different conversations, right? And I think when you're talking about them laying off people at Insomniac because, we're not making the great web anymore and we don't need somebody whose skill set is based on developing entertaining live service games or how to have like an enticing season pass or any of those kinds of things, because those skill sets are not analogous. But what you're talking about, right, is like continued layoffs at these studios as there's a change in leadership. And I think that someone like Herman is more equipped to understand what you lose when you lay people off that are prepared to jump into the next project and needing to spend 8, 9, 10 months or whatever, right? Like hiring people, training them, getting them comfortable with your tool set, getting them comfortable with the flow of working on Horizon or The Last of Us or whatever, versus finding ways to keep those people engaged on other projects like we've seen at Naughty Dog, where it's like, we'll do a remake of The Last of Us Part 1 while we work on the script for our next big game so that we don't have to lay off all the programmers that work here in the interim, right? Like that used to just be par for the course. And we have seen that change at some of Sony studios, right? And I think that your point about him being the guy steering the ship while these layoffs are happening is definitely one that is well observed. My hope is that when it comes to the core teams that are making the kind of marquee titles that we all think of when we think of Naughty Dog and Insomniac and Sucker Punch and all those kind of like big PlayStation studios, that like having someone that comes from that development, mindset, like from being part of that first party, should have an intimate knowledge of what is important to save to, keep those studios what they are,
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Hopefully. But before we move on from this, it reminds me very much of The Office, where Jim and Michael become co-managers. And I want to know, who do you think is day-to-day operations, and who do you think is big picture out of Herman?
It seems like
Hideki?
Herman is day-to-day, right? Like,
he's day-to-day. So Hideki's big picture, you think?
I mean, I don't know. I guess because he's the.
So Herman's Jim. I like seeing Herman as Jim.
I can see that.
I don't like putting that on Hideki though. That he's the Michael Scott. That feels like a dig. I don't know Hideki like that. I don't want to make fun of him.
An official statement.
When they're closing down the studios, they're going to be like in the boardroom with the beans, but not on pieces of paper.
What does a bean mean? All the Sony studios are circling around. See, we got a copy of Horizon with 5 beans on it. Or does Herman not put any beans there because he's biased? That's the question.
I think that's what it's going to be. Yes, I think Gorilla is the Pam Beasley. They're going to get no beans. Herman's not going to want to seem like he's giving money to his side of the.
No, I think you should. Frankly, I think you should give them preferential treatment. I think that's fine. We're gonna leave that one today. Leave that part of this conversation there for today. We do have some more PlayStation conversation ahead of us in just a second here. But before we do that, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of May. They are, of course, Arnold J. Rimmer, Christopher Valenz, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Sobe, Snackago, Steve Stompy, Susan Likes Cats and Also Boobies, Voodoo Vic, Ty the Dude, and Waka Hula. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. You're all the reals to the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows. Remember, if you want to get involved and show your support just like they did, if you want to write into the show, if you want to go check out some of those sister shows, however you want to get involved, head over to flipscreen.games. That's our website where you will find links to our Patreon, where you can get early access to the show, all kinds of other perks and goodies. You can head over to our Discord and keep the conversation rolling between episodes. It is a fun, inclusive place to come and chat games. However you choose to get involved, there's a bunch of links over there you can go click on, and most of them won't cost you a pretty penny. So however you choose to get involved or show your support, head on over there and click on some stuff. Helps us out a lot. And thank you for tuning into the show. So this is a little bit of, we're gonna pull out the cork board and kind of speculate wildly here for a little bit. We're gonna get a little kind of in the leaks and rumors bag today. But there is a confirmed corporate strategy meeting from PlayStation set for later this month on the 23rd of May. And there is a quote from Hiroki Totoki that's been pulled from a blog post that he made about it that a lot of people are thinking could be kind of pointing to a PlayStation showcase, which is something that we've already heard to be rumored. So in that blog post, there's a bit where he says, later this month, you will learn more about the long-term vision for Sony Group and the essential role SIE plays in that vision. As I mentioned previously, fiscal year 24 marks the start of the mid-range plan period for Sony Group, in which we will set the course for sustainable growth. So, the reason that this is, I think, it's kind of that first part, right, that people are reading into. And there is a user on Twitter named Aesthetic Gamer, aka Dusk Golem, who pointed out that last year when they held this meeting, the showcase was on the same day. So that's something that people have pointed to as kind of a precedent being set, that when they have these big investor conversations, it also is often accompanied by some kind of public presentation, right? To let people know what's going on. I think the reason that... go ahead.
I also think it's just time, right? You've appointed new CEOs. I think you're going to want to have them front and center talking about like, I'm so proud of everyone at PlayStation and what I've achieved. And here we are now. We've got a whole new era. And here's what we've been working on. Here's what we've got to show from whatever the hell Naughty Dog's working on.
We also didn't get a proper showcase last year, right? So like we haven't heard from these studios in a long time, and we know that like Sucker Punch is working on Ghost of Tsushima 2, right? Like that's just about to get ported to PC. What a great time to talk about the sequel for the first time, right? Like we know that Guerrilla has a bunch of games in development. We have heard a rumor that God of War Ragnarok is potentially coming to PC next, right? Like there's a lot of stuff Helldivers, right, has been a huge win for them that they haven't gotten to bang their fucking chest about and talk about how great it was and how amazing Arrowhead is and all that, right? Like we kind of...
I wonder if they still think that after the review bombing scandal.
I mean, they reversed it, right? Like they obviously saw that it was valuable enough to be like, oh, okay, cool, great, forget it. 12 million units, right? Like it's the 6th best PlayStation game sales of all time, I think, overall. It's like, obviously a big win for them that I don't think they were expecting to be. We even talked about it last year. Like, that's all they have for the first half of the year. And it's like, I mean, hey, it's one of the games of the year, right? So they got to be happy about that. So I'm with you where, like, seasonally, right? Like, this time of year is when you do one of these presentations, like in June, right? PlayStation loves to jump that first and be the first one out. They didn't get one last year. We had that kind of rumor that the reason they didn't do that was because of the ongoing lawsuit and them not wanting to look more powerful, as they were trying to say that Xbox was threatening them. And, who knows how much of that is true, but the idea that they are ready to talk about what comes next, even if it's a couple years removed, I think makes a ton of sense just based on where we're at in the life cycle of the console and, how long it's been since we've heard from some of these studios, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what Naughty Dog's up to. We don't know what Santa Monica's up to. We've not seen anything from Sucker Punch. Really, the only people that I feel like I have a solid grasp on what they're working on is Insomniac. There's so many studios they've got. Are we going to see something new? The next remaster from Blue Point. Are they working on anything? Like, are we going to
finally right? They're supposed to be working on a new game that's not a remaster, right? Like that's maybe like in an existing IP. Like, where's the sign of that game? We've heard that there's this remake of Horizon Zero Dawn in development in the same way of Last of Us Part 1. Like we've heard about all these projects, and I'm sure that most of them are real, right? Just based on like logic and and
who's talking about them, when
right.
Jeff Grubb or Jason Schreier talks about something, I give it a lot of credence. And I know Jeff's been saying that this showcase is real and it's happening, which makes me think that there's definitely a fire where there's the smoke.
Yeah, so on the Giant Bombcast, I think it was this past week, he said that the PlayStation Showcase is happening this month still, apparently, but whether it's next week or the week after, I honestly don't know. Could be the end of the month, but I won't be surprised if this does actually happen next week. It could happen at any moment. So, I mean, the idea that it could happen either next week or the following week, I think makes a ton of sense, because next week would be before that investor meeting, and if you have a big presentation that's going to have your stock inflate, right? Because you announced the sequel to The Last of Us or the sequel to this or the whatever, right? Like you put all this hype out there and people react to it and it's a big deal. That's going to be a big win for them, right? And it's something that they can then carry into that investor call and be like, what a great year it's been. Helldivers 2 has exceeded all of our expectations. 12 million units in its first 12 weeks of release, has no signs of slowing down. Let's just forget that whole controversy that we had to skirt by. But what a great success this has been. We have all these games that we just announced at our event that everybody's all excited for. X game is coming out later this year. We got these games on the horizon for next year. Like that's the position you want to be in going into that investor call, right? Especially when we know that they've under met console sales expectations, right? After kind of being on a really good trajectory, in some months exceeding where the PS4 was in its life cycle, we've seen a downturn this year, right? Where hardware sales are down across the board for all the console manufacturers. I guess people feeling the squeeze of inflation a little bit, right? And PS5 particularly, I think it was like between 4 and 5% under what they expected, and it's trending lower than the PS4 at this time right now for the first time pretty much ever.
Yeah, Matt Piscatello over at Circana said that it's the 41st month on the market. PS5 unit sales are still trending 7% ahead of PS4 and 66% ahead of the PS3. But it's likely that
66 ahead of PS3. That's really high.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that makes sense when you think of how the
PS3 was rough. Yeah,
and it sold better on the back half of it,
right towards the end.
Yeah. Right.
But it's likely that 2023 was PS5's peak year, at least in the US. But they were definitely, they're forecast to sell 18 million units this year. Fiscal year 2023, they sold 20.8 million. So we're definitely seeing a decline in sales, but that's hardly surprising. It gets to a point where everyone that wants a PlayStation's got one. You don't have a Pro model yet. You've not got the software for people to go, oh, you know what? I was waiting for that must-have game for me to pick up a PlayStation. They've not had that for the last couple of years. Spider-Man's not your jam, and if you're not buying into Square Enix's games, what reason have you had to turn your PlayStation on or to pick one up if you didn't have one?
Yeah, that's how I'm feeling right now. I played Spider-Man, and that was the last time I've turned it on and used it. Really, I'm gonna have to for Elden Ring, but if it wasn't for that, I would have probably already got rid of it. Just because there's nothing on the horizon. They've already said, oh, we're not going to release any sort of games in our major IP. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was sometime this year they said, but we don't have any plans to announce any.
It was like no new games in existing franchises, I think is what they said.
Yeah, which I think is enough for me to go, okay, well, I can't imagine there being any, and I thought maybe Rise of Ronin or Stellar Blade might get me on board, but neither game has really grabbed me. So yeah, that's the way I'm feeling, and I wonder how many people are feeling the same as me if they only own the PlayStation just for PS exclusives, which I've spent the last 2 generations hearing about how they're, top tier, best of the best, and I've played sort of 4 or 5 of them and gone, yeah, cool, that was good, but give me more then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because what percentage of PlayStation's users are actually that person, I think is probably not as big as we think. I think that 12 million units, right, on Helldivers, like I think it's like a third of them are on PlayStation, right? It's like 2 to 1 almost. But it's like for those people, they're playing that, they're playing whatever other third party games that they're playing this year, right? Like maybe they played Final Fantasy, maybe whatever. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that those things inspire console sales. I think that there's plenty to play on the device if that's your main system. But if it's one of the consoles in your arsenal, I'm not surprised if it's the thing that you're playing the least right now, right? Mm-hmm. Or if you're kind of waiting and you're like, oh yeah, I can't wait to play, Spider-Man 2 or any of these other games like Ratchet and Clank maybe that like are not on my PS4, but I can kind of wait until whatever game I feel like pushes, or a price cut or a pro model or whatever, right? And
we got a price hike. We never got a price cut, which is kind of unprecedented as well. I think maybe this is the time where they do sort of show their hand a little bit, especially if the rumors of the pro model coming in this holiday season are true. If you've not got any games to sell me this year, I need to know what the promise is next year or the year after.
Yeah, and I think that narrative then maybe does move consoles. If you're like, okay, PS5 Pro's out, you have a chance to upgrade. There's, these few games that you're really looking forward to are coming out in the next year. Why not buy a new console, when it's on sale or you look for the bundle, right, when it comes out at Black Friday or whatever, that kind of thing. Because yeah, I mean, people do that, right? Like they do buy because I could see you being on the fence and you're like, okay, great, Wolverine's out next year. I'm going to buy it this holiday and I'll play Spider-Man 2 and then I'll jump into that next year, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, people are ready to make big buying decisions and big purchases around the holiday season. A lot of people want to get a console for Christmas, and especially if there's going to be a price cut, maybe on the PS5, if they're just like, oh, well, I don't need the Pro model because I've only got a 1080p TV. I'm not necessarily interested in 4K. It might be a good time for them to jump on then. I think this is kind of on the money. I think we will see a showcase. And I'm excited to see what they've got because, like Max, I've been a bit disappointed in the showing from PlayStation in the last couple of years. But I've been disappointed in the showing from Xbox too. I mean, we had Starfield and that wasn't particularly great, but we've not really had anything else. Hellblade 2 seemingly coming out with
not a ton of fanfare,
burst rather than it's not really much buzz around it. It's even though they're saying that it's like a full marketing campaign, I've seen hardly anything about it. So
I've seen
it's kind of strange.
And the game is out in a week today, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
what is the plan?
Yeah, but I mean, that could come out and be a smash hit in the same way that, Animal Well came out of seemingly nowhere. I didn't even realize that game was dropping, and it's been a massive success, and so was Balatro, right? It could be that this is one of those games that comes out and everyone's talking about how you've got to play it. And I think PlayStation needs that. The next you've got to play it game. The next thing from Naughty Dog, I think, would really drive sales. I think we need to see what they've been cooking up, because seemingly it's just been remasters and adaptations that they've been working on in the meantime, and a failed live service game, which is embarrassing for Sony, especially considering they announced that on a stage and it was like a big thing, and then they had to just kill it in a blog post.
Yeah, I think they're at a point where like we need marketing beats, because like I think that yeah, I mean, I don't know. I certainly don't think that either of you are wrong to feel the way that you feel. And like, as somebody that also owns multiple devices, right? Like, I haven't spent much time with my PlayStation since earlier this year when I was playing Final Fantasy, and I'm gonna probably get back to that later this year, right? So like, I've had about a big game a year to play, right, on it, but I do kind of think that the narrative that you guys are kind of finding yourselves in is probably not one that's representative of like the broader PlayStation audience. Because I think if you look at the last 6 months, like, I mean, they have 3 really big releases, right? Like, they had Spider-Man 2, they had Final Fantasy, and they had Helldivers. And I think at the end of this year, or at the end of last year, right, Spider-Man was a Game of the Year candidate, right? Didn't win, but it was in the conversation. And then this year, I think Helldivers will probably win a lot of awards and will be a game that people look, when you look back on 2024, Helldivers will be one of the 3 or 4 games that you mention as like one of the big games of the year. I think that's definitely true. And then, Final Fantasy is a big release for the people it's a big release for.
Well, yeah, but that's if we're talking about like numbers, Helldivers and Spider-Man sure sold a lot, but didn't Last of Us, sorry, Final Fantasy underperform like for the most recent one? It did.
But it's also like, I guess, by what metric, right? Like by Square Enix's expectations, it's like, yeah, that's a shame, but it's like that doesn't discount that as being a significant exclusive for the platform, right? Like it's kind of what we're talking about, right? It's like, I think the problem with where we're at is that game development is at an apex of being very expensive and taking a very long time. And, like y'all have had, like when you look back on the last quarter, there are 2 major exclusive releases on the console, and the attitude is like, well, what else? And it's like, I mean, it's like at a certain point, I think you got to just accept that like not every release is for every player. And as we see that growth, it's like, it's increasingly difficult to serve everybody's needs all the time on your platform, right? And it's like, I think if you're somebody that wants to have a really healthy, varied diet, right, like we do, you have to have multiple platforms at your disposal and be able to jump and play the big thing that's on Xbox, or the big thing on PlayStation, or the big thing on PC, or the big thing on Nintendo. And like,
or we see a shift towards multi-platform, which I'm interested in talking about potentially next week, and whether that's like the future, because that's the way Square's been saying that they had it this week. That maybe we'll see the next Final Fantasy VII on Xbox.
Well, and I think that like when you talk about that, right, like that's part of the equation of what we're discussing anyway, right? Of like, oh, like what's PlayStation got right now, and it's like, well, if you're a PlayStation gamer and that's like where you play primarily, then it's like everything that's come out, right, is you played on PlayStation, and it was a PlayStation game to you, right? And most of the big releases come there. So it's like, what are you missing out on aside from the odd exclusive on the other platforms that, we just talked about have not been setting the world on fire anyway, right? Or they're niche, or they only speak to one segment of the market. And if you're not that player, like if you don't care about Starfield, then what are you missing out on if you don't own an Xbox? Is the same question, If you don't care about Tears of the Kingdom or, Pikmin 4 or whatever, like what are you missing out on with Nintendo? It's like nothing, So it's like then it becomes an issue of taste. And when I think you're somebody like us that like we all have varied wide palates and we want to try a lot of different stuff, like you're always going to kind of be like hungry for what's next. But for a lot of people, they're probably still playing Helldivers, or they're still chipping away at Final Fantasy, or they're still playing whatever third-party game that you and I played somewhere else, but that's where they played it, you know? And it's like, I think that is one thing when you're talking about satiating a market you already have, but when you're trying to move units and you're trying to, you know, get people into the ecosystem, yeah, like you need to have these big hype marketing beats. And, you know, Sony's been kind of playing their cards close to their chest. And I think it's far past
It's been difficult for them, right? You know, it's got to be difficult to get your marketing beats right when you don't know what direction the company's going in. Your CEO's retired in air quotes, and all of the games that he was championing are being cancelled.
Yeah, you're pivoting away from a strategy you thought was the future of the company, right? So it's like, I think they're in a really tumultuous period right now, to be sure, but it's like, I think they're pretty well positioned to come out the other end of it okay, is if they play their cards right. But it's like, I mean, who knows, right? Like, to your point, this whole two CEOs thing might be a huge debacle. So, yeah, I don't know.
Turns out, you know, imagine it turns out Hideaki really likes NFTs, and that's the future of PlayStation. We never know. We never know.
We'll never know. We'll end the things there for today, though. Thank you guys for joining us here in another episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. If you want to write in and let us know your thoughts on the future of PlayStation, your thoughts on the new two CEO future between Herman Hulst and Hideaki Nishino, I would love to hear from you in the audience and what you're thinking. I think we're going to have a conversation next week, maybe, depending on how the news goes about the future of exclusives, because I think between Square Enix's comments and the success of Helldivers on PC and everything going on Xbox, it's something that I'd love to pull on that a little bit more. So if you guys want to write in with your thoughts for next week's show, or, you know, the next 2 week shows, depending on how things go with news next week, about your feelings about exclusives. Do you like them? Do you not like them? Do you think that they are good for platforms and creating an identity and selling hardware? Do you think that they are, you know, something that only hurts the games by limiting the number of people that can check them out? I'm very interested in hearing from the community, because it's something that, you know, we're pretty split on here, and it's something that I think, you know, seemingly is up for a lot of debate and change in the next couple of years. So would love to get your thoughts in the community on how it's affecting your purchasing habits and everything. So remember, if you want to write in for next week's show, there's a bunch of ways you can do that. Head over to flipscreen.games. That's the website where you will find links to all the places we are, all over the web, all the places you can get the show, get involved, write in, show your support. You'll find them all right there, flipscreen.games. Head over there, check out all the cool stuff we got going on, be a part of the community, however you choose to do so. We thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. For the crew, I've been Pete, he's been Max, he's been Steve. We'll see you next week.
Started